For 50 years, she was the perfect wife, the silent partner, the ghost in the machine of a great man's empire. But when her tyrant husband died, her children didn't see a matriarch to be honoured, they saw a burden to be discarded. They tried to put her in a home, sell her house, and erase her from the legacy she helped build. They had no idea they weren't just lighting a match. They were waking a dragon. This is the story of how a forgotten woman took back her life, one devastating secret at a time. If you believe in the quiet power of those who have been silenced for too long, then follow our channel, like this video, and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. The scent was the first lie. White lilies, thick and suffocating, a perfume of manufactured sorrow. Elizabeth Vance sat in the front pew of the Viridian Oaks Chapel, a black veil draped over her face, a piece of lace that did nothing to hide the profound, arid emptiness in her eyes. The organ music swelled, a tide of sound meant to carry grief, but for Elizabeth it carried nothing. It was just noise. Her husband of 50 years, Richard Vance, was dead. The man whose presence had been a constant, suffocating pressure on her soul was gone. And in his place, there was only a strange, hollow quiet. A void, not of loss, but of absence. The removal of a great weight. From the pulpit, men in expensive suits spoke of Richard in booming, reverent tones, a titan, a visionary, a pillar of the community. They painted a portrait of a man Elizabeth had never truly known, or perhaps a man she had known all too well, but whose true colours were only visible to her. She watched her son, Robert, step up to the lectern. His face was a perfect mask of grief, his voice catching at all the right moments. He spoke of his father's strength, his unwavering guidance. Elizabeth saw the performance, the careful choreography of mourning she had seen him rehearse in the mirror that morning. Beside her, his wife, Chloe, dabbed a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. Her gaze, however, wasn't on the casket. It was scanning the pews, cataloguing the influential faces, the powerful connections, the opportunities that even a funeral could present. Later, back at the sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking the city, the performance continued. The house, their home for half a century, was filled with a low murmur of condolences and the clinking of glasses. Elizabeth stood near the grand fireplace, a statue in black silk, as guests offered her their practiced sympathies. He was a great man, Elizabeth, an immeasurable loss. His legacy will live on forever. She would nod, her lips forming a polite, meaningless smile. The words were stones dropped into the vast, empty well inside her. They made no splash. She watched Robert and Chloe work the room. Robert, with his inherited confidence, clapping a senator on the back. Chloe, a shark in Chanel, her smile sharp and predatory as she cornered the CEO of a tech conglomerate. They were a team, a well-oiled machine of ambition. Elizabeth had seen this ambition before. It was a distorted echo of Richard's. Eventually, they made their way to her, their duty finally calling them to the grieving widow. Chloe's hand, cool and dry, rested on Elizabeth's arm. "It was a beautiful service, wasn't it?" she whispered, her voice a conspiratorial purr. So many important people came to pay their respects. Daddy would have been so proud. Robert draped an arm around his wife's shoulders, pulling her close. His eyes, so much like his father's, were already looking past Elizabeth toward the future, "The Legacy Gala is in 2 weeks," he announced, his tone shifting from somber to businesslike in a single breath. A tribute to Dad, of course. But, more importantly, it's the official launch of the Vance Foundation's new environmental initiative. We're securing the next 50 years of the Vance name. Chloe's smile widened. It's going to be the event of the season. We've got reporters from Forbes and The Times confirmed. It's all about momentum, you see. Elizabeth remained silent, her gaze fixed on the portrait of Richard that hung above the mantelpiece. The artist had captured the cold glint in his eyes perfectly. Robert finally turned his full attention to her, though his focus felt thin, obligatory. "Mom," he said, his voice softening into a tone of patronizing concern she knew all too well. It was the voice Richard used when he was about to deny her something. "About the gala. It's really a very business-forward event. Lots of technical presentations, fundraising pitches, networking. All about the new venture. Honestly, you'd be bored to tears." Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. "And you'll still be in mourning, of course. It wouldn't be right to force you into a big, loud party so soon. It's best you rest. Take some time for yourself." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was a dismissal, a clinical, efficient amputation. She, Elizabeth Vance, the woman who had proofread every one of Richard's early business plans, who had hosted the dinner parties that secured his first investors, who had sacrificed her own dreams to become the silent, supportive bedrock of his empire, was being uninvited from the celebration of it. She was no longer a partner. She was no longer the matriarch. She was a relic, an inconvenient reminder of a past they were eager to repackage and sell. She looked from her son's determined face to her daughter-in-law's saccharine smile. In their eyes, she saw her own erasure. The gala wasn't a tribute to Richard's legacy. It was the coronation of his successors, and in their new kingdom, there was no room for the Dowager Queen. A cold, hard clarity began to form in the void inside her. It wasn't grief. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was the first chilling realization that the cage she had lived in for 50 years hadn't vanished with the death of the zookeeper. It had just been passed down to his children. The front door finally clicked shut, the last of the mourners gone, and a silence, unlike any she had ever known, descended upon the house. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, accusatory. It filled the cavernous rooms, clung to the velvet curtains, and settled like a fine layer of dust on the polished mahogany surfaces. For 50 years, this house had never been truly quiet. It had always hummed with Richard's presence, the commanding thud of his footsteps on the marble floor, the incessant ring of his private telephone line, the low growl of his voice that could curdle the very air. Now, in his absence, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. To Elizabeth, this place wasn't a home. It had never been a home. It was a stage, a meticulously designed, impeccably maintained theatre for the grand performance of the perfect Vance family. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every polished floorboard was a piece of the set. A silent witness to Richard's absolute, suffocating rule. She drifted through the formal living room, her hand trailing over the back of a silk brocade sofa. She remembered the night Richard had bought it, not because she liked it, but because the wife of a potential business partner had admired a similar one. Everything was for show. Everything was a calculated move in his long, intricate game. Her gaze fell upon the grand piano in the corner, its lid closed and coated in a thin film of disuse. She hadn't played in decades. She used to love to play. Chopin, Debussy, her fingers would dance across the keys, the music a secret language for the things she could never say. But Richard had disliked it. "It's a frivolous distraction, Lisa," he'd said one evening, closing the lid with a soft final thud. "A wife's time is better spent supporting her husband's ambitions." And so she had stopped, just like that. One of 1,000 small surrenders that, over time, had amounted to the abdication of her entire self. The walls seemed to whisper his rules back to her, echoes trapped in the plaster. "Don't speak unless spoken to at dinner parties. Your opinions are not required. That dress is too bold. You are a Vance. We have an image to maintain. Smile, Lisa. The photographers are here. We are a perfect family." A memory, sharp as broken glass, surfaced. They were at a charity ball. She had been talking to an old friend from college, laughing at a shared memory. Richard's hand had suddenly gripped her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, a silent, brutal command. His voice, a low hiss in her ear, was barely audible over the orchestra. "We are a perfect family, Lisa. You will act the part. Do you understand me?" She had understood. The price of peace, the price of a life without open conflict, was her complete and total compliance. She wandered into his study, the heart of his power, a room she had rarely entered without being summoned. The air was still thick with the ghost of his cigars, his scent. For years it had been a symbol of his suffocating presence. Now it was just a stale smell in an empty room. His massive oak desk was clear, already sanitized by Robert and his assistant, but the indentation in the red leather chair was still there, a faint outline of the man who had sat there for countless hours, building his empire, issuing his decrees. She ran her fingers over the worn leather. It felt cold. Her journey through the house was a pilgrimage through a life lived in the shadows. Each room held a ghost. The dining room, where he had announced he was mortgaging their first home to fund a risky venture, without ever consulting her. The master bedroom with its separate, silent dressing rooms, a metaphor for their entire marriage. She was a ghost in her own life. A silent partner in a contract she had never been allowed to read. Her slow, aimless path eventually led her to the French doors at the back of the house, which opened onto the manicured lawn. The gardens were Richard's pride and joy, a testament to his belief that nature, like everything else, could be tamed and forced into orderly submission. Roses grew in perfect geometric beds. Hedges were trimmed into sharp, unnatural angles. Not a single weed dared to show its face. And at the far end of the lawn, partially obscured by a weeping willow, was a small, dilapidated structure that defied the surrounding perfection. A gardening shed. It was old, its wood weathered to a silvery grey, its tin roof streaked with rust. A thick, gnarled vine of ivy had crawled up one side, as if trying to pull it back into the earth. It had a heavy, rusted padlock on its door. For as long as she could remember, that shed had been locked. It was Richard's private domain. A place she, the gardeners, even the children had been strictly, unequivocally forbidden from entering. "It's just for storage, old tools," he had grumbled once, when a young Robert had asked what was inside. "Nothing that concerns you. Stay away from it." The command had been absolute. Over the decades, the shed had become a piece of forgotten geography on their own property, a blind spot in their daily lives. But now, in the profound quiet of her new widowhood, her gaze was drawn to it. It stood there, a stark, ugly anomaly in Richard's world of pristine control. It was the one thing on the entire estate that was unkempt, untamed, and secret. Why? Why lock a simple gardening shed? What tools needed that kind of security? For the first time in 50 years, a question formed in Elizabeth's mind that was entirely her own. It wasn't about what to wear, or what to cook, or whom to impress. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated curiosity, a tiny spark of defiance against the ghost whose rules still echoed in the silent house. She stood at the glass door, her reflection a pale figure against the darkening lawn, and stared at the shed. The walls of her prison were still standing, but for the first time she had just noticed a loose stone. A week bled into the next. Each day a landscape of grey monotony. The condolence calls trickled to a stop. The bouquets of funereal flowers wilted and were thrown away. The silence in the house deepened, becoming less a novelty and more a permanent resident. Elizabeth found herself drifting, untethered from the rigid schedule that Richard's life had imposed on hers. There were no more dry-cleaned suits to lay out, no more business dinners to plan, no more tense breakfasts spent listening to him read the stock market report. The machinery of her life had ground to a halt. In its place was a vast, intimidating expanse of time. One afternoon, as she sat in the sunroom staring out at the relentless order of the garden, the sound of a car crunching on the gravel driveway startled her. A sleek, silver SUV, too modern and aggressive for this old house, pulled up to the front steps. Robert and Chloe. They hadn't called. They breezed in, bringing with them the scent of the outside world, coffee and ambition. Chloe was dressed in a pristine white pantsuit, Robert in a casual but expensive-looking polo shirt. Their smiles were too bright, too practiced, for a house that was still technically in mourning. "Mum, we were just in the neighbourhood," Chloe chirped, placing a pair of designer paper coffee cups on the polished mahogany table, an act of casual sacrilege that made Elizabeth flinch. "Thought we'd pop in and see how you're doing." "We brought you a latte," Robert added, pushing one of the cups toward her. "Oat milk, just how you like it." She didn't like oat milk. She drank black tea. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It showed how little they truly saw her, how little they knew of the woman who existed outside of her role as their father's wife. She didn't reach for the coffee. "What is it you want, Robert?" she asked, her voice flat. There was no energy in her for pleasantries. Chloe's smile didn't falter. She glanced at Robert, a silent, practiced cue. He cleared his throat and took the lead, adopting the calm, reasonable tone of a man handling a delicate but necessary business transaction. "Mum, we've been thinking a lot about you, about the future," he began. "We're worried about you being here all alone. This house, it's a lot to manage, the upkeep, the taxes, the memories." Chloe reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a stack of glossy brochures, fanning them out on the table like a hand of winning cards. The title on the top one read, "Silver Creek Senior Living, a New Chapter in Golden Years." The cover featured a stock photo of two silver-haired seniors laughing as they played shuffleboard. Elizabeth stared at the brochures. The paper was thick and expensive. The colours were soft and soothing. It was the packaging of a product designed to make the unthinkable seem palatable. "Look, Mom," Chloe said, her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that set Elizabeth's teeth on edge. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on a picture of a small, beige room. Private suites, à la carte dining, social activities, group outings, 24/7 care on site. There's even a water aerobics class. It's more like a resort than, well, you know. She didn't say a home. She didn't say a nursing home. The words were too ugly, too honest. Robert chimed in, leaning forward earnestly. Dad would have wanted you to be comfortable, Mum. He would have wanted you to be safe, not rattling around in this big old house all by yourself. It's not practical." The word practical hung in the air. It was a word Richard had used constantly. It was his justification for everything. "We've already spoken to a realtor," Chloe added, her voice a little too bright. "Brenda Howard. She's the best in the area. She says the market is incredible right now. With the location and the size of the lot, we could get an offer within a week. A very, very good offer." There it was. The final, brutal truth, laid bare on the mahogany table between the untouched coffee and the glossy lies. They wanted to sell the house, her home, the place where she had raised them, the place that held every memory, good and bad, of her entire adult life. They weren't just suggesting she move. They were evicting her. The message, wrapped in the silk of feigned concern, was a dagger. "You are a burden. You are in the way. Your life is an inconvenience to our plans. Get out." Elizabeth looked from the brochure to her son's face. She saw no love there, no genuine worry. She saw his father's cold pragmatism. She saw a man eager to liquidate his past to finance his future. She looked at Chloe, at her sharp, hungry eyes. She saw a woman who viewed her not as a mother-in-law, but as a final, tiresome obstacle standing between her and the full inheritance. For 50 years, Elizabeth had absorbed countless blows. She had endured dismissal, control, humiliation, and invisibility. She had bent until she thought her spine was permanently curved into a posture of submission. She had silenced herself until she had almost forgotten the sound of her own voice. But this was different. This wasn't a command from her husband, the man she had been conditioned to obey. This was a betrayal by her own children. It was the casual, callous disposal of her, as if she were an old piece of furniture that no longer fit the new decor. A strange calm settled over her. The years of repressed anger, of swallowed resentment, of quiet, gnawing pain did not erupt into a fiery rage. Instead, they coalesced. They compressed under the immense pressure of this final insult and solidified into something cold, hard, and incredibly dense. It was the birth of a purpose. She slowly raised her eyes and met Robert's gaze. He faltered for a moment, a flicker of something. Guilt? Uncertainty? Crossing his face, before Chloe's subtle, sharp glance steadied him. Elizabeth picked up one of the brochures. She studied the smiling faces, the sterile, hotel-like rooms. She felt the weight of the glossy paper in her hands. Then, with a quiet, deliberate motion, she placed it back on the table. "Thank you for your concern," she said, her voice even and steady, devoid of the emotion they had expected. There was no pleading, no crying, no anger, just an unnerving stillness. "I will, of course, give your offer the consideration it deserves." The fuse, buried for half a century under layers of duty, fear, and forced compliance, had just been ignited. Robert and Chloe didn't hear the sizzle. They saw only the quiet, agreeable old woman they had always known. They smiled, relieved, believing they had won. They had no idea that they had just declared war on a woman who had nothing left to lose. The silence of the house was no longer empty, it was waiting. Richard's study, once the unassailable fortress of his will, now felt like a tomb awaiting excavation. Elizabeth moved through it, not with the timidity of an intruder, but with the cold purpose of an executor. For 50 years, this room had been the source of every command, every judgment, every subtle erosion of her own being. Now it was just a room, filled with expensive, meaningless things. His scent, a cloying mix of old leather, paper, and self-importance, still lingered, a ghost she was determined to exorcise. She didn't search frantically. Her movements were deliberate. A stark contrast to the frantic hammering in her chest, she ran her fingers along the spines of books he'd never read, touched the cold marble of a bust of some forgotten Roman emperor he'd admired, and stared at the imposing mahogany desk. It was a throne, and from it he had ruled their world, her world. She pulled at the drawers. The first was filled with monogrammed stationery, the inkwell still full. The second held cigars, dried and brittle. The third, a collection of cufflinks, small glittering symbols of his corporate armour. She pulled it out all the way, the heavy wood groaning in protest, her breath hitched. It was the bottom drawer, the one that always stuck. She ran her hand along the underside of the heavy oak, her papery skin snagging on the rough, unfinished wood. And then she felt it. A small, flat rectangle, held in place by yellowed, brittle tape. Her fingers, though trembling, worked with a surgeon's precision. She peeled back the tape, the sound like tearing skin in the dead quiet. A small, tarnished brass key fell into her palm. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with decades of forbidden knowledge. It was small, ornate, and utterly familiar. The key to the one place on this vast estate she was never, ever allowed to enter. The old gardening shed at the far edge of the property. A place Richard had dismissed as full of junk, yet had kept locked as if it held the crown jewels. "There's nothing in there for you, Liza," he had said, his voice deceptively gentle, a velvet glove over an iron fist. "Just dirt and rust." She didn't hesitate. She walked out of the study, down the grand curving staircase and through the cavernous kitchen, the key clutched so tightly in her hand its edges dug into her flesh. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. The path to the shed was overgrown, a testament to how long it had been neglected, forgotten by everyone but its gatekeeper. The structure itself was dilapidated, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. A single window clouded with grime. It looked innocuous, unimportant. Exactly as he'd intended. The lock was stiff, rusted by years of coastal air. Elizabeth put her shoulder into it, gritting her teeth as she turned the key. It resisted, a final, futile act of defiance from beyond the grave. Then, with a percussive crack that echoed in the grey afternoon, the mechanism gave way. The door swung inward on a long, agonised creak, releasing a puff of stale, musty air. It smelled of petrified soil, decay, and secrets. The interior was cloaked in shadows, cobwebs hanging like macabre lace from the rafters. Old terracotta pots were stacked in crumbling towers, rusted trowels and spades leaned against the wall like skeletal sentinels. Bags of fertilizer had hardened into stone. It was exactly as he'd described it, dirt and rust. But her eyes scanned the space, looking for something out of place. And there it was. Tucked behind a stack of rotted firewood, almost completely obscured, was a small, grey, metal box. A deed box. It was locked. They came up, of course. A simple, functional lock this time. No key required if one had enough force. She didn't go back for a tool. She grabbed the nearest implement, a heavy iron-headed spade. The handle was rough in her hands. She lifted it, the weight of it a surprise, and brought it down on the small lock. The first blow just dented the lid. The sound was shocking, a violent clang that shattered the afternoon's peace. She struck it again, and again, a grunt of effort escaping her lips with each impact. Sweat beaded on her forehead. This was not the action of a grieving, frail widow. This was the action of a prisoner breaking her own chains. On the fourth blow, the lock burst, the metal screeching in protest. She knelt, her knees aching, and pried the lid open. There were no jewels, no hidden stacks of cash. Her heart, which had been pounding with a frantic, wild rhythm, settled into a slow, heavy beat. The contents were far more valuable, far more dangerous. On top lay a sheaf of thick, cream-coloured paper, folded and bound with a faded blue ribbon. The legal language was dense, but she didn't need to read it all. Her eyes found the names. The property description was for the large commercial plot downtown, the one Richard had acquired in the early 90s. The plot, where the ostentatious glass and steel Vance Legacy Hall now stood, waiting for its dedication gala. And the name on the deed, the sole registered owner, was not Richard Vance. It was Elizabeth Annabel Vance. The name was typewritten. The document dated from before her marriage. A relic of a small inheritance she'd received from a distant aunt. An inheritance Richard had told her he'd invested wisely for their future. He had never transferred it. He had simply built on her land, absorbing it into his empire, confident she would never think to question, never dare to look. It was the ultimate act of possession, erasing her ownership, while using its very foundation to build a monument to himself. Beneath the deed lay something else, a stack of leather-bound journals, Richard's journals. She recognised his meticulous, slightly backward-slanting script instantly. He had documented everything, a compulsion for control that extended even to his own history. She opened the first one. The entries were dry, filled with figures and business dealings. But as she flipped through the pages, a name began to appear with increasing frequency. Marcus Thorne. She remembered Marcus. He was Richard's first partner, a man with the kind of easy charm and genuine vision that Richard had always lacked and therefore resented. The journals detailed their partnership, their shared ambitions. But the tone shifted in the entries from early 1992. The meticulous notes on profits and projections were interspersed with frustrated, angry scribbles about Marcus's reckless optimism and unrealistic projections. Then the entries became sparse. The last mention of him was dated October 17th, 1992. It wasn't a narrative entry. It was a simple, chilling ledger line. M. Thorne Partnership. Asset dissolution. Finalised. Below it, in a different, more hurried script, Richard had written a single sentence. Some liabilities must be permanently retired.
He hadn't just vanished. He had been erased, dissolved, retired. Richard had taken their shared assets and built his empire, alone. Elizabeth closed the journal, the leather cool against her trembling hands. The cold resolve that had been a spark was now a raging fire in her veins. She had found the key, she had found the truth, and now she had found her weapon. A few days later, the oppressive silence of the mansion was broken by the sound of a familiar car crunching up the gravel driveway. It was Leo, her grandson. At 17, he lived more in the glow of a screen than in the strained, heavy atmosphere of his family's reality. He was a quiet, observant boy,
with his mother Chloe's dark hair, but with a kindness in his eyes that was all his own. He found her in the sunroom, staring out at the grey, churning sea. "Hey, Grandma," he said, holding up his tablet. He had that slightly awkward energy of a teenager trying to connect with an older generation. You busy? Never too busy for you, Leo, she said, managing a genuine smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He was the one part of her family that didn't feel tainted by the Vance legacy. Cool, check this out. He sat beside her, the bright screen a stark contrast to the gloom outside. I've been digitizing all those old boxes of photos from the attic, you know, for the cloud, so they don't get ruined. He swiped through a few images. A young, smiling Elizabeth on a beach. A stern-faced Richard at a groundbreaking ceremony. A family portrait where everyone's smile looked painted on. Anyway, I got curious, he continued, his voice dropping a little, as if sharing a secret. I kept seeing this one guy in all the really old pictures with Grandpa. So I ran his name through some online archives. He tapped the screen, and a new page loaded. It was a Reddit forum, a subreddit, he'd called it once. r/unresolved mysteries. The thread was old, but had been revived periodically over the years. The title read, The Disappearance of Marcus Thorne, the tech entrepreneur, who vanished in '92. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. She leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the screen. There he was. A grainy photo of a smiling, dark-haired man, with his arms slung around a much younger, leaner Richard. They were standing in front of an empty lot, the very lot she now knew was hers. People are still talking about him, Leo said, oblivious to the storm gathering inside his grandmother. He was Grandpa's first partner. They were supposed to build some big tech company. Then, poof, he'd just disappeared.
Police reports said he cleared out his bank accounts and left the country. But people on here don't buy it. They say the evidence was too neat, too clean. He scrolled down, pointing to a comment. See? This user, TruthDigger92, thinks the timeline is suspicious. Thorne vanishes, and a month later, Grandpa suddenly has the sole capital to launch Vance Industries. It's like a whole conspiracy theory. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't a theory. It was a journal entry. Asset dissolution. Leo looked up from the tablet, his brow furrowed. It's weird, though. I tried asking Dad about him once. Just, hey, who was this Marcus Thorne guy? And he totally lost it. Got super mad, told me to stop digging into things that don't concern me, and to have some respect for Grandpa's memory. He shrugged, a gesture of teenage bewilderment. For me, it's just an interesting old mystery, a digital ghost. But for Dad, it's like he's afraid of it. Elizabeth placed a hand over Leo's, her touch steady despite the tremor she felt deep inside. Thank you for showing me this, Leo, she said, her voice quiet but firm. It is very interesting. For Leo, it was a historical puzzle, a bit of online sleuthing. For Elizabeth, it was confirmation, the final piece of the board falling into place. Richard hadn't just erased a man from his business, he had tried to erase him from history. But he hadn't counted on the persistence of memory, and he certainly hadn't counted on the long, unforgiving reach of the internet. The drive into the city felt different. The familiar skyline, dominated by the gleaming steel of Vance Towers, no longer looked like a symbol of family success. It looked like a crime scene. Amelia Harrison's law office was on the 40th floor of a rival building, a sleek, minimalist space with panoramic views of the city. Amelia herself was the opposite of minimalist. She was a force of nature, with a sharp bob of silver hair, a wardrobe of brightly coloured power suits, and a laugh that could shatter glass. They had been friends in college, two women with very different ambitions, who had recognised in each other an unyielding core of strength. "Lisa," Amelia said, enveloping her in a hug that was both warm and bracing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Elizabeth replied,
her voice low. "I think I've found one." In the sterile quiet of Amelia's conference room, Elizabeth laid everything out on the polished glass table. The original deed, its paper yellowed with age, Richard's journals, open to the damning pages. She even showed her the Reddit thread Leo had found. She explained everything, from the locked shed to Robert's suggestion of a nursing home. Her voice never wavered. The time for trembling was over. Amelia listened, her sharp eyes moving from the documents to Elizabeth's face and back again. She picked up the deed, holding it as if it were a sacred text. She read it, then read it again. She then skimmed the journal entries, her expression hardening with every line. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, her voice a low whistle. "He really was a son of a bitch, wasn't he?" She tapped the deed with a perfectly manicured nail. "This is ironclad, Liza. The chain of title is clean. You are the sole legal owner of Lot 7, Block 14, Downtown Commercial Sector. And by extension, you are the owner of the multi-million-dollar building currently sitting on top of it." A wave of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over Elizabeth. "So I can stop them?" "Stop them?" Amelia let out a short, sharp laugh. "Liza, you can do more than stop them. You can evict them. You can bulldoze the place and plant a rose garden if you want to. You own the land and everything on it. The Vance Legacy Hall is legally your property." But then Amelia's expression grew serious. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But you need to understand what you're about to do. They will not go quietly. Robert, Chloe, they are Richard's children in every sense of the word. They will see this as an attack, not a legal claim. They will fight you with everything they have. They will use the full weight of the Vance Corporation's legal team to crush you." She held Elizabeth's gaze. "They will try to break you. Are you ready for that?" "They already broke me, Amelia," Elizabeth said, her voice flat. "I'm just picking up the pieces." Amelia's warning proved to be prophetic, and the first volley in the war arrived less than a week later. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't a visit. It was a thick, cream-coloured envelope delivered by a stone-faced courier who required a signature. The envelope bore the letterhead of the most expensive and ruthless law firm in the city, Sterling, Croft and Gable, the Vance Corporation's bulldogs. Her hands shook as she opened it. The document inside was a formal cease and desist. The language was cold, brutal, and designed to intimidate. It accused her of making spurious and fraudulent claims against the estate of the late Richard Vance. It painted her as a confused, grieving widow, susceptible to delusions and fantasy. But it was the final paragraph that felt like a physical blow. It stated that if she persisted in these baseless allegations, the Vance Corporation, with Robert Vance as its representative, would have no choice but to petition the court for an emergency conservatorship citing advanced age and apparent elderly cognitive decline as reasons she was no longer fit to manage her own affairs. Cognitive decline. The words leapt off the page. A clinical legalistic branding. They weren't just going to fight her, they were going to erase her, declare her mentally incompetent, a non-person. It was Richard's strategy, perfected and passed down to his son. If you can't control someone, discredit them. If you can't silence them, declare them insane. The war had begun and the first shot was aimed directly at her mind. The legal threat struck a deep, resonant chord of fear that vibrated through 50 years of learned submission. For a moment, the cold resolve shattered, and the old Elizabeth, the one who knew how to make herself small and quiet, resurfaced. The legalese of the letter blurred, and the heavy, expensive paper felt like a shroud in her hands. Decades of ingrained obedience, of knowing that her own thoughts and desires were secondary, that her role was to be a silent, supportive pedestal for Richard's greatness, rose like bile in her throat. The carefully constructed walls of her new self faltered, and the ghost of the woman she had been whispered insidious doubts in her ear. "Who are you to do this? He was your husband. This is your son. You will lose everything." The letter transported her. The sterile scent of the law firm's paper was replaced by the acrid smell of smoke. It was a night in late 1992, a few weeks after Marcus Thorne had left. The house had been suffocatingly quiet. Robert was away at boarding school. It was just her and Richard, rattling around in the cavernous space that was supposed to be a home. She had come downstairs for a glass of water and found him in the study. He wasn't working. He was standing before the grand fireplace, feeding papers into a roaring blaze. Not logs, but thick stacks of documents from a cardboard box at his feet. The firelight danced across his face, casting his handsome features into a demonic mask of sharp angles and deep shadows. He moved with a calm, methodical purpose that terrified her more than any outburst of rage. "Richard, what are you doing?" she had asked, her voice a timid tremor in the vast, silent room. He didn't turn at first. He simply tossed another file into the flames, watching as the paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into glowing embers that floated up the chimney like departing souls. "Housekeeping," he said, his voice flat. She took a hesitant step closer. She could see the letterhead on the top file before it, too, was consumed. It was from the architecture firm he and Marcus had been working with. "Richard, where is Marcus?" she had asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "His wife called again. She's worried sick. She says no one has heard from him." He finally turned then. The warmth of the fire didn't touch his eyes. They were cold pits, black and depthless. He looked at her not as his wife, but as a potential liability, a loose thread in the grand tapestry of his ambition. "Some foundations are built on sacrifice, Lisa," he said, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. "Difficult, but necessary sacrifices, for the good of the future, for the good of this family." He took a step toward her, and she instinctively flinched. "For the good of our son's future. You will never ask that question again. You will never speak his name in this house again. Do you understand me?" It wasn't a request. It was an edict. She had looked from his chillingly calm face to the fire, where the last vestiges of a man's life were turning to ash. She saw the truth in that fire, in his eyes. She didn't know the mechanics of it, whether it was a body buried in a desert, or a bank account emptied, and a life threatened into exile. But she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, that Marcus Thorne was gone because Richard had willed it. And she had said nothing. She had nodded, a small, pathetic dip of her head. Her silence had been her complicity, her continued life of luxury, the private schools for Robert, the galas, the vacations, all of it had been purchased with that silence. She hadn't just been a resident of the gilded cage. She had helped Richard weld the door shut, with her quiet acceptance as the final seal. Now, sitting in her sunroom with the lawyer's letter in her lap, that guilt was a physical weight. It pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The legal threat of conservatorship was terrifying, but this internal reckoning was worse. Was she any better than him? She had lived off the profits of that sacrifice for 30 years. To destroy the Vance legacy now felt like the ultimate act of hypocrisy. This was Robert's inheritance. Her son. He was arrogant, dismissive and cold, a true product of his father, but he was still her son. Was it fair to punish him for the sins of a father he had been raised to worship? Was destroying his entire world, his identity, his future, worth dredging up a past she herself had helped to bury? The path to justice for Marcus Thorne, a man she barely knew, was paved with the ruins of her own family. The weight of it threatened to crush her resolve, to push her back into the familiar, comfortable silence of the last 50 years. The letter lay on the table, a formal demand for her surrender. And for a long, terrifying moment, she considered it. The memory came not as a whisper, but as a crack of thunder in the quiet cathedral of her mind. Richard's voice, slick with self-satisfaction, echoing from decades past. Foundations, my dear Elizabeth. Every great legacy is built on foundations of sacrifice. She had nodded then, the dutiful wife, imagining he meant long hours and missed dinners. She had been a fool. The word foundations unlocked a different vault, a memory she had long dismissed as one of his many eccentricities. It was the summer after Marcus Thorne had vanished, melting away from their lives and the business like morning mist. Richard had become consumed, not by grief for his partner, but by a feverish, almost manic project. He had ordered the small, perfectly functional office building on the commercial lot to be torn down, a structure he and Marcus had built together. She remembered standing at a distance, the dust and the screech of metal filling the air, and watching Richard direct the demolition crew with a chilling intensity. Then came the second phase, even stranger than the first. He didn't break ground for a new building. Instead, he had truckloads of rich, dark soil brought in, tons of it, to be laid over the thick, undisturbed concrete foundation slab of the old office. And upon that slab, upon that layer of purchased earth, he commanded the creation of the most elaborate rose garden Viridian Oaks had ever seen. Hundreds of bushes, deep-rooted varieties, their thorns like tiny daggers. He'd supervised the planting himself, his expensive shoes caked in mud, a grim satisfaction on his face. He called it a memorial, a place of beauty. Now, 50 years later, Elizabeth knew it for what it was, a tombstone. A beautiful, fragrant lie. The realization settled in her bones, not with horror, but with a cold, clear certainty. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place. The deed in her name, the diary, the disappearance, the garden. It was all one story. Her hand, steady and purposeful, reached for the phone. She didn't hesitate. She dialed. Amelia Harrison. Amelia, she said, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. It was the voice of a woman who had just signed a declaration of war. It's Elizabeth. Liz? Are you all right? I've been worried since we last spoke. That letter from Vance Corp's lawyers was vile, Elizabeth finished for her. Yes, I know. But it was also a gift, Amelia. It was the push I needed. I need you to do something for me. Something that cannot be questioned and must be executed immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The sound of Amelia's professional curiosity piqued. I'm listening. I need you to file an emergency work order with the city for the property at 1 Vance Legacy Plaza. The Legacy Hall? On what grounds? Robert will fight it tooth and nail. They'll claim harassment.
He can claim whatever he likes, Elizabeth said, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall, seeing through it to the garden that no longer existed. The grounds are structural instability. We have reason to believe the original foundation slab, The one the hall was built around is compromised. We need to conduct urgent geological surveys. Seismic foundation retrofitting. Use whatever language you must. Make it sound terrifying. Make it sound non-negotiable. Amelia was silent for a long moment. Elizabeth could picture her leaning forward in a leather chair, tapping a pen against her legal pad. Elizabeth, what are you really looking for? The truth, Amelia. I'm looking for the foundation Richard really built his empire on. Another beat of silence. Then Amelia's voice returned all business.
A private forensic and excavation team will be more discreet than a city crew. More efficient. They'll need access. And a work order like that, filed by the legal owner of the property, they won't be able to stop it in time. Not without a court injunction, and will file it after hours, the day before. It'll be a done deal before their lawyers have had their morning coffee. When do you want to do this? Elizabeth took a deep breath. It was time to light the fuse. On the night of the Legacy Gala, she said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. I want the work to begin precisely as the party starts. The night of the gala arrived on a wave of shimmering heat and flashing cameras. The Vance Legacy Hall was a beacon of opulence, a monument to a lie, its glass and steel facade reflecting the endless parade of luxury cars. Inside, it was a spectacle of cultivated power. The air was thick with expensive perfume, the murmur of polite gossip and the clinking of champagne flutes. Robert and Chloe stood near the grand entrance, radiant, a modern king and queen presiding over their court. They were the very picture of success, their smiles perfectly calibrated for the photographers. On a massive screen behind the bar, a looped video played. It was their daughter's TikTok, a montage of filtered smiling moments under the hashtag Vance Legacy. A dynasty for the digital age. Then, a hush fell. Not a sudden one, but a slow, rolling wave of silence that started at the door and washed over the entire foyer. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Elizabeth Vance had arrived. She was not the frail, grieving widow they expected. She was not the confused old woman Robert had painted her as. She wore a simple sleeveless navy dress, the colour of a midnight sky. It fell to her ankles, elegant and severe. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight, impeccable chignon. Her face was calm, her posture erect. She didn't look like an uninvited guest. She looked like an angel of reckoning. She took one step into the foyer, then a second. Before she could take a third, Robert was in front of her, his body a physical barrier. His radiant smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of thunderous fury. The charm he wore for the world dissolved, revealing the petulant, cruel boy underneath. "Mum," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous growl meant only for her. "What in God's name do you think you're doing? I told you, you were not invited." Elizabeth met his gaze. Her own was like a frozen lake, calm, deep, and unbreakable. "You are making a scene," Robert continued, his eyes darting around, aware of the growing audience. The whispers were starting to rise again. "You need to leave, right now. Go home." "This is my home, Robert," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden stillness. Or at least, the land it sits on is. You seem to have forgotten that. Rage flashed in his eyes, raw and ugly. He was losing control. The carefully constructed image of the magnanimous son was cracking. "That's enough. You're delusional. You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me." He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod over her shoulder. Two imposing security guards, men built like refrigerators in ill-fitting suits, moved to flank her. Their presence was a clear threat. The venue manager, a man with a frantic, sweating face, scurried over, wringing his hands. "Mr. Vance, is there a problem?" the manager stammered. "Yes," Robert snapped, never taking his eyes off his mother. "This woman is trespassing. Please escort her out." The guards took a half-step forward. The crowd held its collective breath, a thrilling scandal playing out before their very eyes. This was better than the champagne. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She didn't look at the guards. She didn't look at the panicked manager. She held her son's furious gaze. For 50 years, a look like that from a Vance man would have made her shrink, apologize, retreat. Tonight, it was fuel. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her simple clutch purse. She didn't hurry. Every movement was measured, graceful. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft click of the purse's clasp. She withdrew 2 folded documents. She handed the first to the venue manager. "I believe you'll find this is the original notarized deed for this parcel of land," she said, her voice steady and clear, ringing with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her. "The name of the owner is Elizabeth Ann Vance. That's me." The manager's eyes bulged as he scanned the document. His jaw went slack. Elizabeth then turned to the 2 security guards who had frozen in place. She held out the second document. "And this," she said, "is an official, legally stamped emergency work order filed with the city and effective as of 1 hour ago. It permits my crew, who are at this moment setting up on the North Lawn, to conduct extensive foundation work. As the legal owner of this property, I have authorized it." She finally turned her head, a small, regal movement, and addressed the entire stunned foyer. Her voice rose, not in a shout, but with a resonant power that commanded the space. "My name is Elizabeth Vance," she declared. "I own this property. This gala, it seems, is a private event, to which I was not invited. Technically, that makes every single one of you a trespasser." A wave of shocked murmurs swept the room. Chloe, who had been gliding towards them, stopped dead, her perfectly painted smile frozen in a rictus of horror. Robert's face had crumpled. The rage was still there, but it was now laced with a dawning, sickening disbelief. He looked like a man who had just watched the world turn upside down. As if on cue, the glass doors opened again. This time it wasn't a guest in a tuxedo. It was 2 uniformed police officers. They walked in calmly, their eyes scanning the scene. Robert's head snapped towards them, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He thought they were here for her. Elizabeth gave the faintest of smiles. She gestured gracefully towards the officers. "However," she continued, her voice now laced with a fine, sharp irony, "I am in a generous mood. I will permit the party to continue, for now. And these gentlemen," she nodded to the police, "are not here to cause any trouble. Amelia Harrison, my lawyer, informed them of the situation. They are simply here to ensure my work crew is not disturbed. You could say they are my guests." She folded her hands in front of her. The Queen had checked the king. The game was hers. Without another word, she walked past her son. He didn't move. He stood there, rooted to the spot, the deed and the work order acting as invisible chains. She moved through the parted sea of guests, a silent, formidable ship sailing through waters that were suddenly entirely her own. She found a quiet alcove with a clear view of the stage and the main floor. She didn't take a glass of champagne. She didn't speak to anyone. She simply stood and she waited. It took nearly 20 minutes for the buzz to die down. for the frantic whispers to be shushed. It took an immense effort of will from Chloe, who moved through the crowd with a brittle, desperate smile, assuring everyone that it was just a small family misunderstanding, a regrettable symptom of her dear mother-in-law's advanced age and grief. But the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The gaiety was gone, replaced by a tense, electric anticipation. Everyone knew the first act was over, but the play was far from finished. Finally, Robert appeared on the stage. He looked pale, but he had managed to reassemble his public face. The mask of the confident air was back in place, though it sat uneasily on him now. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the hushed hall.
"Friends, colleagues, welcome,"
he began, his voice straining for a jovial tone.
"Welcome to a night 50 years in the making. A night to celebrate a true titan of industry.
A visionary, my father, Richard Vance." As he spoke, Elizabeth watched him, the dispassionate observer. He was launching into the hagiography she knew by heart, the well-worn speech about vision, integrity, and building a legacy from the ground up. He spoke of sacrifice, and Elizabeth felt a cold smile touch her lips. He had no idea. "My father believed," Robert continued, his voice gaining a bit of its usual performative confidence, "that a foundation isn't just concrete and steel. It's an idea, it's a promise to the future. The Vance Legacy Hall stands on that promise." Behind him, the massive screen that had been projecting the static #Vance Legacy logo began to flicker. At first it was subtle, a glitch, a momentary distortion. The tech crew at the side of the stage exchanged confused glances. Robert, warming to his topic, didn't notice. He built this company, this legacy, for all of us, for the community, for his family. The flicker intensified. The logo dissolved, not into black, but into a wash of bright white light. And then an image resolved itself on the screen. It wasn't a photo montage. It wasn't a tribute video. It was a live feed. High definition, multi-angle. The source was unmistakable. It was the flood-lit lawn just outside the hall's main doors. The image was stark, clinical. It showed a large rectangular pit dug into the earth, the dark soil piled high on either side. It showed a team of people in practical work gear, moving with quiet, professional purpose. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Robert paused, distracted by the sound. He glanced behind him at the screen. For a second, he just stared, uncomprehending. What was this? Some sort of construction video? A mistake? From the back of the room, near the AV booth, a young man watched, his face pale in the reflected glow of the screen. Leo. His face was a mask of terrible, dawning comprehension. He had done what his grandmother had asked. He had given her team remote access to the hall's systems. He had thought it was about property rights, about embarrassing his father. He had not understood, not until now. On the screen, one of the cameras began a slow, deliberate zoom. It pushed past the wide shot of the excavation site, past the grim-faced foreman, and settled on one of the technicians who was kneeling in the bottom of the pit. The technician, a woman in a jacket marked forensics, was working meticulously. She wasn't using a shovel. She was using a set of delicate brushes, like an archaeologist at a dig. The camera moved in closer still, the lens so powerful that the audience could see the individual bristles of the brush. The technician was carefully, patiently,
brushing away the last of the dark, rich soil from an object half buried in the ground. The object was pale off-white. It was curved. It had hollows that looked unnervingly like eye sockets. The technician's final, gentle sweep with the brush cleared the last veil of dirt. There was no longer any ambiguity. There was no room for doubt. It was, unmistakably, a human skull. A single collective gasp sucked the air from the room. It was a physical sound, a vacuum of horror. A champagne flute shattered on the marble floor, the noise like a gunshot in the sudden dead silence. The silence lasted for a single, frozen heartbeat. Then came the chaos. A woman screamed a high, piercing shriek. The murmur exploded into a roar of panicked, horrified voices. People surged backwards, away from the stage, away from the horrifying image on the screen. Phones were whipped out, dozens of them, their screens now recording the larger screen, capturing the downfall of a dynasty in real time. Robert stood frozen at the podium. All the colour had drained from his face. He was a statue of hubris. His mouth slightly open, his eyes locked on the image of the skull. The speech, the legacy, the lie, it had all turned to ash in his mouth. Through the pandemonium, Elizabeth began to walk. She moved with the same unhurried, implacable calm with which she had entered. The crowd parted for her, as if she were Moses, and they were the Red Sea. She walked to the stage, climbed the 2 short steps and approached her son. He didn't seem to see her. He was still staring at the screen, at the foundation of his entire life being unearthed. She reached out and gently took the microphone from his limp, nerveless hand. He let it go without resistance. She turned to face the horrified, mesmerized crowd. She took a breath, and the amplifier carried the soft sound to every corner of the vast, chaotic room. Her voice, when it came, was not vengeful. It was not triumphant. It was filled with a terrible, profound sadness, a grief for a truth buried for 50 years. "My husband," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise, "did not build his legacy on vision." As she paused, letting the words hang in the air, she looked across the sea of faces until her eyes found Chloe. Her daughter-in-law stood beside a marble column, her perfect makeup unable to hide the raw animal terror in her eyes. The #Vance legacy was a horror story now, and she was trapped in it. Elizabeth's gaze held hers for a moment before returning to the crowd. He built it on a body. The admission landed with the force of a physical blow. The last vestiges of decorum shattered. The police officers, her guests, were already moving, speaking into their radios, beginning to cordon off the exits, transforming a high society gala into a crime scene. Elizabeth looked at the shell of her son. She raised the microphone one last time. "For 50 years I was a coward," she confessed, her voice thick with the weight of that long silence. "I chose comfort over courage. I chose wealth over truth. I saw the dirt on his shoes, and I smelled the roses, and I asked no questions. I helped bury the secret with my silence." She lowered the microphone, her statement complete. As the first officers began to approach the stage, she looked at Robert one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was no anger. There was only a profound and devastating pity for the boy who had built his life on a tomb and called it a kingdom. "But tonight," she whispered, the words for herself alone, "the debt is paid." The first sign of the new season wasn't a date on a calendar, but the way the fog over the Pacific began to burn off an hour earlier each morning.
It rolled back from the shore like a slow, tired ghost, revealing a steel-grey ocean that gradually warmed to a brilliant, impossible blue under the climbing sun. The air that drifted through the open screen door of the cottage no longer carried the scent of cloying funereal lilies, the fragrance Richard had insisted on filling every room of the Vance estate with. Here it smelled of salt and kelp and wild, stubborn sagebrush clinging to the cliffs. It was the smell of things that were raw and alive. Elizabeth sat in a simple wooden chair on her small porch, a thick ceramic mug warming her hands. The coffee was hers, not brewed by a silent housekeeper to the exacting bitter specifications Richard had demanded, but made by her in a cheap drip machine, exactly how she liked it, a little too weak, with too much cream. It was a small, daily rebellion, one of many. 6 months had passed since the night the Vance dynasty had imploded under the glare of television cameras and the unblinking eye of a forensic archaeologist's lamp. The name itself, once a titan of industry and philanthropy in Viridian Oaks, was now a contagion. It was whispered in country clubs with a delicious, horrified shudder. It was splashed across the tabloids that still, even now, found their way into the local grocery store, their headlines screaming arias of ruin. The Vance Vendetta. Wife's Revenge uncovers corporate graveyard. From empire to ashes. How one woman toppled a tycoon's house of lies. Elizabeth never bought the papers. She didn't have to. The fallout was a constant low hum in the background of her new life. It came in the clipped professional updates from her lawyer, Amelia Harrison. The calls were less frequent now, the initial storm having passed, leaving behind the long grinding work of legal demolition. She remembered the last one, just a week ago. She'd been kneading dough on a flour-dusted countertop. Her hands, once soft and manicured for display, now strong and capable. "Good morning, Elizabeth." Amelia's voice had come through the phone, crisp and clear as always. "Just a quick update for you. The federal prosecutors have officially frozen Robert's remaining offshore accounts. They found the shell corporations he used to siphon funds from the foundation." "It seems your son learned more from his father than just how to give a speech." Elizabeth had paused, her knuckles deep in the soft dough. She felt nothing, not triumph, not pity, just a vast, quiet emptiness where a mother's love used to be. "And Chloe?" she had asked, her own voice steady. A sigh on the other end of the line. "Chloe is cooperating, fully. She's turned over every document, every email. She's trying to cut a deal, painting herself as another one of Richard's victims. It's a performance, of course, but it might be enough to keep her out of a prison uniform. The lawsuits will strip her of everything else anyway. The Thorne family is suing for wrongful death, and now that the financial fraud is public, every investor Richard ever swindled is coming out of the woodwork. They're ruined, Elizabeth, in every conceivable way." Ruined. The word hung in the quiet kitchen. It was the same word Richard had used to describe Marcus Thorne all those years ago, a word he'd used for any business rival who dared to stand in his way. Now it had come home to roost. A vulture picking clean the bones of his own legacy. "Thank you, Amelia," Elizabeth had said, her hands resuming their rhythmic pushing and folding of the dough. "Keep me informed." She hadn't asked for the details of the trials. She didn't need them. She had been the judge, jury, and executioner on that terrible, glorious night. The rest was just paperwork. The process of selling the estate had been its own kind of exorcism. She'd insisted Amelia handle everything, wanting to never set foot in that house again. The prison of perfect taste, as she now called it. Amelia described the scene to her later. Real estate agents, walking on tiptoe, speaking in hushed tones as if in a mausoleum.
Prospective buyers, foreign investors, tech billionaires, who saw only square footage and resale value, blind to the ghosts that screamed from the wallpaper. The great house, the stage for 50 years of silent agony, was sold for a fraction of its worth, the stigma of its history too much for even the most ruthless developer. The Heritage Hall, the gleaming monument built on a man's bones, was seized by the city. There was talk of tearing it down, of turning the land into a public park, a memorial to Marcus Thorne. Elizabeth hoped they would. She hoped they'd plant a garden, a simple one with wild flowers, not roses, never roses. With the proceeds, she had paid her debts. First, a substantial anonymous donation to a foundation for the families of unsolved disappearances, a quiet atonement for her 50 years of silence. Then she'd paid Amelia's fees, a sum that made the stoic lawyer blush. The rest she put into a simple trust. It wasn't a fortune, not by Vance standards, but it was more than enough. It was clean. And then she had simply disappeared. She'd packed one suitcase with a few clothes, the old metal box with the deed and Richard's journals, and a single framed photograph of a boy with a bright, innocent smile, taken long before he learned to call her a burden. She drove west, towards the setting sun, not stopping until the road ran out and met the sea. The cottage was a rental, small, weathered by the salt and wind, with windows that rattled when the storms blew in. It was the most beautiful home she had ever had. Here the silence wasn't a weapon. It wasn't the suffocating absence of words that had defined her marriage. It was peace. It was the space between the crash of the waves, the cry of a distant gull. It was the freedom to think her own thoughts, to feel her own feelings, without a filter of fear. Her quiet life had a rhythm. The morning coffee on the porch, a long walk on the beach, collecting sea glass, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. In the afternoons, she read, not the classics Richard had approved of for her bookshelf, but paperback thrillers and messy, contemporary novels where women were complicated and flawed and loud. She was discovering a world that had been kept from her. The mail was usually just bills and local flyers, but today there had been an envelope, standard white with a postmark from Viridian Oaks. Her heart had given a painful little lurch. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. A teenager's scrawl caught somewhere between the careful letters of childhood and the impatient slash of adulthood. It was from Leo. She had carried it out to the porch, her hands trembling slightly. It had sat on the small table beside her for over an hour, a white rectangle of judgment. She was terrified of what it might contain. Accusation, hatred, a final definitive severing of the last family tie she had. He was the only one she'd agonized over, the only collateral damage that truly haunted her. In her mind, she had imagined him hating her, seeing her as the monster who had destroyed his world. Finally, her fingers, stiff with a sudden chill despite the morning sun, had broken the seal. The paper inside was cheap notebook paper torn from a spiral. There were dark, circular stains on it, and she knew with a mother's certainty that they were tear stains. She unfolded it and began to read. Grandma, it began. The word itself was a small miracle. I don't know where to start. I got your new address from Miss Harrison's office. She said you wanted to be left alone, but I had to write. I hope that's okay. Everything here is a nightmare. Mom and Dad, they don't talk to each other. They just have lawyers who talk for them. Dad he's like a ghost. He walks around the rental apartment they got, staring at the walls. Sometimes he yells about how you betrayed him, how you destroyed everything Grandad built. He calls you senile, a monster. Mum just cries. She told me once, late at night, that she always knew something was wrong with the family,
that it felt like living in a beautiful house that was about to collapse. She said she was just too scared to look at the cracks in the foundation. I'm staying with Aunt Carol now. School is weird. People look at me differently. Some of them whisper. The friends I thought I had are gone. Their parents told them to stay away from the Vance boy. It's like our name is a disease. For a while, I was so angry. At you, at everyone. You blew up my whole life. Everything I knew was gone. Dad, Mum, our house, our name, all of it, just gone, in one night. I rewatched the news clips online. I saw you on that stage. You looked so calm, so powerful. I hated you for it. I hated you because you didn't seem sad. You just seemed finished. But then I started thinking. I remembered things. I remembered how Grandad used to talk to you at dinner, like you weren't even there. How he'd cut you off if you tried to tell a story. I remembered how Dad started doing the same thing.
I remembered that look in your eyes, the one you always had at those big parties, that polite, empty smile. I used to think you were just quiet. Now I think you were screaming, and no one could hear it. And I read Grandad's journals, the ones you left with Miss Harrison for the investigation. The police let me see copies. They wanted to know if I recognised any of the names. I read what he wrote about Marcus Thorne, what he wrote about business, about weakness being a sin, about building an empire at any cost. He was the monster, wasn't he, Grandma? He was the poison. And it was starting to infect all of us. Dad was becoming him. I was scared I would become Dad. I don't know if I can forgive Dad for what he did, for how he treated you, for trying to just throw you away like you were an old piece of furniture. It's too soon. I'm still too angry. But I understand what you did. I think I do. You weren't just getting revenge. You were lancing a wound. A big, infected, rotten wound that's been festering for 50 years. It hurt. It hurt more than anything. But if you hadn't, the poison would have just kept spreading. It would have killed us all from the inside out. You had to end the lie. You set us all free, Grandma, in a way. I hope you're okay. I hope you found a place where the walls don't whisper. Love, Leo. Elizabeth folded the letter slowly, her movements precise, her vision blurred by a film of tears she hadn't realised were falling. They dripped from her chin onto her simple cotton shirt, leaving dark spots like Leo's own. One by one she wiped them away, not with a delicate handkerchief, but with the back of her hand, a gesture that was rough and real. She had lost her son. She had lost the life she had known. She had traded a gilded cage for a rented cottage, a legacy of power for a legacy of truth, and the cost had been immense. It had carved hollows into her heart that would never fully heal. But Leo's words, "You set us all free." It wasn't absolution. It was understanding. It was a bridge built across the rubble of their family, a fragile connection forged in the fires of a terrible truth. It was the one thing she hadn't dared to hope for. It was everything. She placed the letter on the table, her gaze lifting from the tear-stained paper to the vast, endless horizon. The sun was high now, glinting off the water, a million shattered diamonds of light. The ocean stretched out before her, immense and powerful, its depths holding secrets far older and deeper than any of Richard's. She had lost her family, her home,
her past. The 50 years she had given to the Vance name had been built on a lie, and now they were nothing but dust. A ghost story told by the elite of Viridian Oaks. But as a wave crashed against the shore, a deep, percussive roar that vibrated through the wooden porch and up into her bones, she felt something she hadn't felt in half a century. It wasn't happiness. Happiness was a shallow, fleeting thing, a bright floral pattern on a suffocating dress. This was something else. Something deeper, heavier. It was the quiet, solemn, and liberating peace of owning her own soul. It was a thing of substance, weighty and real in her chest. The tide was coming in, washing the beach clean, and for the first time Elizabeth felt ready to see what it would bring. Elizabeth's story is a testament to the fact that it is never too late to reclaim your own truth, no matter how long it has been buried. Her 50-year silence was broken by an act of incredible courage, changing her life and the lives of those around her forever. We all have truths we hold inside. What is a moment in your life when you chose to speak up, even when it was difficult? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice has power and your story matters.